Test 1, 2. Sega!
Comix Zone. It's a game I coveted when I first read about it in a gaming magazine years ago, and being a massive comic book fan, the prospect of being able to play an interactive comic book was one that I couldn't pass up. So I did a little research for this video because to date there hasn't been any other game like Comix Zone ever released, and that's a bit strange when you consider the amount of games that get copied and cloned or borrowed from others. This game's unique comic book layout seemed like the perfect blueprint for the endless amount of comic book video games that would subsequently emerge over the next 23 years since its release back in 1995, so why didn't it happen? Well, it turns out the answer is pretty simple actually, and one that I never really considered. Sega applied for and was granted a patent for a video game system for creating simulated comic book games. So there you have it. I guess they decided to hang on to that. The most glaringly obvious aspect of Comix Zone is definitely its bright and vibrant graphics that look as if they've been ripped straight out of a comic book, and the game's core mechanics, which actually take place within the confines of comic book panels, complement the visuals perfectly as you navigate Sketch Turner from panel to panel in an attempt to defeat the evil mutant Mortis and escape your own comic book after lightning strikes it, setting Mortis free. It doesn't really explain how Sketch ends up in his own comic book, but I guess the newly freed Mortis must have overpowered him and thrown him into the comic or something. It doesn't really matter, as all that was needed was a premise to have the game take place in the pages of the comic book. It's a unique concept and one that works extremely well, pushing the Sega Genesis hardware to the absolute limit. It's pretty amazing what Sega managed to achieve here with the 16-bit hardware, from post-apocalyptic wastelands, desert landscapes, secret underground lairs, Tibetan-style monasteries, to the impressive final battle taking place in an incomplete page. Concluding with two possible endings, Comix Zone's beautifully drawn backdrops are impressively detailed to say the least. And that's just the most obvious visual aspects you're seeing. There's all sorts of nice little touches strewn throughout the game, such as little paper shreds floating off the page whenever you hit an enemy, Mortis physically drawing enemies onto the page, and less obvious things like weather effects. When I was going through some of the footage, I didn't realize that panels became brighter when it stopped raining, as my attention was usually focused on kicking the shit out of these lumbering fucksticks. But it doesn't stop there, as this game's soundtrack was just as unique as its comic book panel concept. A techno-rock soundtrack on a 16-bit console was simply unheard of, yet somehow, the Sega wizards managed to get American composer Howard Drosen's magical musical composition onto this game despite the limitations of the console's Yamaha YM2612 sound chip. I was interested to learn how sound works on a console such as the Genesis, and it turns out that a ROM cartridge, or game cartridge as they are commonly referred to, simply contains a set of MIDI data, which is essentially read by a medium, in this case the Sega Genesis console. The funny thing is that the Genesis was usually criticized for having poor audio, especially when compared to the Super Nintendo, so my guess is that a lot of people ended up having to eat their words after listening to this awesome soundtrack. I mean, just listen to this. So we know that it looks and sounds great, but how does it play? At its core, Comix Zone is a beat 'em up packaged in a very niche concept, and a look at the majority of reviews would yield the consensus that Comix Zone stumbled with its game mechanics. Now I admit that the controls are a bit fiddly at times, but to say that the game sours quickly due to monotonous gameplay is pretty unfounded in my opinion. There is a host of moves that Sketch is capable of executing, and you are encouraged to use them in a combination of low to high attacks the more you progress, as the enemies increase in difficulty quite quickly. Furthermore, apart from the usual pickups like knives, health, and bombs, you are also aided by your pet rat Roadkill, who can be let loose to help solve puzzles, attack enemies, or sniff out hidden items and parts by tearing open a section of the page. And while there is certainly a lot of variety when it comes to bad guys ranging from mutants to kung fu masters, unfortunately it's not just bad guys and bosses you need to worry about, as hitting solid objects such as crates or doors, which you are forced to do in order to progress, will take life, which is pretty fucking ridiculous for a beat 'em up. So for that reason, I'd highly recommend holding onto items such as bombs, and rather save them for obstacles as opposed to bosses. I mean, at one point I had a full life bar that was dwindled down to almost halfway because I had no usable items, so in my opinion that is the only real stumbling block that Comix Zone has. All in all, Comix Zone is fantastic. It looks and sounds great, has a solid beat 'em up core, and apart from the relevant shortness of the game and aforementioned niggle, it definitely still holds up today.